Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and our educational program, the Palestine Center. My name is Zaina Azam, and I'm the executive director here. And welcome also to our online viewers. You know, we live stream all of our events, and so we have lots of people who are watching elsewhere, and they also tweet questions to us. We are so delighted today that Ghada Karmi, Dr. Ghada Karmi, she's a doctor, author, and academic, that she agreed to include the Palestine Center as a stop on her tour to give a talk about her new book, Return, a Palestinian Memoir. We're happy that you are with us today. Welcome and ahlan wa sahlan to you, Dr. Karmi. This book chronicles her experience of leaving Britain, which she calls her adoptive home after her family's exile from Palestine, and returning to and working in Palestine. Dr. Karmi's encounters with politicians, fellow Palestinians, and Israeli soldiers, and others cause her to question what role exiles like her have in the future of their country, and whether return is truly possible. She is actually focusing her remarks today on the whole idea of return. And on a side note, the Washington Report for Middle East Affairs has just published a review of her book, and you can pick up the magazine outside after the talk. We also will have copies of Dr. Karmi's book for sale after the talk, and she has agreed kindly to stay and sign the copies for you. I've asked Dr. Karmi to speak for about 35-40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. And as I mentioned, our online viewers can tweet their questions to us at Palestine Center. So now let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Ghada Karmi was born in Jerusalem and trained as a doctor of medicine at Bristol University. She established the first British Palestinian medical charity in 1972 and was an associate fellow at the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Her previous books include Jerusalem Today, What Future for the Peace Process?, The Palestinian Exodus 1948 to 1998 with Eugene Cotran, Married to Another Man, Israel's Dilemma in Palestine, and the best-selling novel In Search of Fatima. She writes frequently for The Guardian and The Nation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ghada Karmi.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I've been here several times. And it's lovely to see. Friends amongst you and people that I would also like to know and would consider friends. Yes, as you heard, I'm in the United States to promote my new book, Return, and this is my first stop. I arrived here yesterday. I tried to deal with my jet lag, but here I am. So as you heard, this book is called Return, and if you, at that distance, can see the cover, you will see, or if you can't, let me tell you, there are open palms, and across them is a long, old-fashioned key. Now, this image I imagine means something to most of the people here. Am I right? Yeah. And I tell you, this image has acquired the status of an icon. It is a Palestinian icon because, of course, as you know, what it stands for is the keys to the houses of people who were forced out of their homes in 1948. And they kept their front door keys in the belief that they would not be away for long and would be going back home, so they had to have the key. Now, you know the rest. They never went back home, but they still retained the key as evidence of something that was true and that happened in the past and was still the case. Now, one of the things that has always animated my work and my activism and so on is the Palestinian right of return. You must know that it's not fashionable now to talk about it. People talk about the occupation, the settlements, the separation wall, the rights in Jerusalem, intifadas. Nobody talks about the right of return. Whereas the right of return is the fundamental cause why there is a conflict, and it will not be solved until the Palestinians are allowed to go home. This is not a slogan, it's a reality. And I am very engaged in the idea of return because of how important it is, not just to us, you know, but for obvious reasons, not to us Palestinians, but for most people, you know, people returning from somewhere they used to live and come back to see it, people who are expatriated, not thrown out, they've just got a second home or something and they decide to stay there, and then they think, no, I want to go and see my home again, I want to return. And of course, for many people who cannot actually physically return, there is an emotional return, an imaginary return. So there are all kinds of return, and this theme the book is really around this theme. But as you heard, it represents 3 months that I spent in Ramallah working for the Palestinian Authority as a consultant. Now, in 2005, I should say 3 months in 2005. Now, I very much wanted to go because I had a feeling that this was a kind of return to a part of Palestine. And I thought, well, if I go, I don't want to go as an expert or a researcher or tourist or something, because, you know, I don't know how many people have been to Ramallah, the occupied areas, etc. It is absolutely littered with something called an NGO. There are NGOs, you can hardly breathe, there's so many NGOs, and they're all busy. I have no idea what they're busy with, but they call themselves, I don't know, concerned with education or health or I don't know, women or gender or God knows what. But of course it doesn't make the slightest difference to the situation of the Palestinians, none whatsoever. But what it does do, and you can see I feel quite strongly about it, it gives them a salary, money, and it gives them some kind of interesting assignment, you know. So, you know, and insofar as I don't think we Palestinians wish to be the objects of study or the objects of an assignment, you know, we have a real problem with the Israelis. Anyway, so I thought to myself, okay, I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to go and work with the Palestinian Authority, because my feeling was that I would get to know the situation in the occupied territories from the inside, if you see what I mean. And that's what I did. Now, I went quite innocently. Of course, I had my views about the Palestinian Authority. I knew quite a lot about it. I did not like what I heard, and I thought, never mind. You know, I'm going to go and see how I get on. And so I went to the Ministry of Media and Communications, and I was assigned as a media consultant because I'd done a lot of work with you know, with media in Britain and elsewhere. So that was what I was invited to do. I went to this ministry with very little suspicion that there was anything, that there was anything going on. So I got there, and I noticed that there was a lot of hostility towards me. I couldn't understand it. I mean, I didn't know them, they didn't know me, so I don't know why. They were very hostile. And the ministry was headed by apparently the deputy minister, because the minister worked in another building somewhere away from this. Now, the ministry I was working in was very old and dingy and horrible. And the ministry where the minister was bright and modern and new, but I had to work for this ministry. Anyway, I still thought, okay. So I went quite innocently after I'd been there for a day or so. I asked to see the deputy minister because I thought this was only correct. He should have asked to say hello to me, but I thought I'd better go and say hello. So without any suspicion, I went to his office, and I noticed there were about three men there, all with worry beads and bearded, and they seemed to be his cronies. I don't know what they were doing there at all. They never said anything. And there was the sort of a young man who obviously made the coffee, and he was hanging around, sort of half asleep. So I turned up, and I said hello, and he was very affable, this man. And I said, well, I've come to work with you, on the question of media representation of the Palestine case. Now, there was an office manager, a woman called, don't laugh, Esperance. Now, this woman was a bit past middle age. She was really quite horrible. She hated me on sight. It was quite obvious. And she was very close to the deputy minister. So they had a kind of a little thing going. And, and there I was, quite innocently. Anyway, so I said hello. I thought I should say hello to you. And I'm looking forward to working with you. And he said, working with? He paused as if milling over this strange idea. Esperance also tells me that you want to rewrite our media strategy, he continued, smiling at the others. What's wrong with the present one? But then his manner grew serious, and he frowned. Doctora, this will not do for us. We have practices and procedures in place, very successful ones, and it's best for you to learn about these before rushing in to make changes. Isn't it the same in England? He stressed the last word. Esperance, who had until then been looking straight ahead with a detached air, could not suppress a smile of pleasure at this. I didn't intend to offend you or anyone, Dr. Sabah, I said, feeling wrong-footed and defensive. I merely thought to start working as soon as I could on updating what I'm sure is a very good media strategy. That is part of what I am here for. Esperance, he turned towards her. What do you say? She responded with alacrity. The doctora was only trying to help, I think, but she's new and doesn't understand what we do here. She asked the staff to talk to her in her office, each one by themselves. She left the rest to her listeners' imagination. Dr. Sabah laughed in exaggerated disbelief. I realized that he already knew all this. He cleared his throat and addressed me. Doctora, we don't do such things here. Our people aren't used to it and may tell you whatever comes into their heads. You should leave the staff to Esperance. She's very good at handling them, and you should stick to whatever it is you're here for. I had grown exasperated by him, by the gleeful Esperance and the bearded men who stared vacantly at me all the time. Dr. Sabah, I said, I don't know why you know so little about why I'm here, or what goes on between you and Dr. Fareed, that's the minister. I was appointed to this ministry through the UN, and with Dr. Fareed's knowledge and consent. He should have briefed you before I came. He's the person you should talk to. Dr. Sabah was not a bit put out, but the affability he had shown earlier was now gone. Dr. Fareed doesn't work here. We weren't told anything about you or that you were coming until a few days ago. It's a wonder, and only thanks to Esperance, that we found you an office. He could barely disguise his irritation and scorn. I was stunned and humiliated. I didn't know what he meant about Dr. Fareed, but I could see that I had mishandled the situation badly when I should have known better. Years of working as a doctor within the labyrinthine National Health Service system in Britain of office politics and rivalry had apparently taught me nothing. And really, I tell you, it was like that. I felt so. Anyway, finally, somebody took pity on me and explained that the deputy minister and the minister detested each other, which I didn't know. And so everything that was anything to do with the minister was immediately an object of hate. So since it was the minister who'd appointed me, I became the object of hate with this Dr. Saba. Anyway, it's all pretty miserable. Now, in case you should think all of it was taken up with this business, although you'll see a lot of it is because I was very anxious to convey to the readers what really is the situation with the PA. That this is sitting in Ramallah, practicing a kind of pretend politics with a pretend president and a pretend prime minister and pretend ministers. And, Israel is the sovereign. So, what are these games that these people were playing? It was really pathetic and funny at the same time. And in the bubble that is Ramallah, I don't know if anybody's visited Ramallah here. Yes, well, you know what I mean, that you can sit in Ramallah and feel it's normal, life is normal. You can go to cafes and restaurants and bistros, it's lovely, until you try to leave Ramallah and you're immediately against a checkpoint. Anyway, I was determined not just to sit and work for this ministry, but to go out and see the rest of the Palestinian cities. So I went to various places, and the contrast between these places and this PA and all this playing about and so on was so stark. It was really shocking. Now, in this short extract I want to share with you, I was in Hebron, and I went to Hebron to see it with a British journalist and a couple of Italian human rights workers, and we drove down there, and the human rights people took us to a farm just outside Hebron, and this farm, if you looked from the road, it was sitting in between two settlements, and it was quite sort of long and thin, the farm, or what was left of it. And we learnt that the land that belonged to the farm had been taken over for the settlement. And really there was very little land left for this farmer. Now, in Hebron, people may be aware, grapes are a very important crop. And it was August, and that is the time for grapes. But this man had little land, although he still had a vineyard. So his land having been taken, and he had so little, and these settlers were really, really appalling. They behaved in a way, they wanted to get him out, basically. So they had all-night parties. They set their dogs on to his grandchildren. Their children were encouraged to be abusive to his children and grandchildren, and it made his life a hell. But he would not, he said, I will never go. I will, anyway. So they took the thing to court, and he thought that something might happen. Anyway, but that was not the end of the story. Recently, matters had got worse for Abu Ibrahim, that's who the farm was. The Israeli authorities, which came to connect the settlements around his farm to Israel's national water carrier, had at the same time disconnected his supply. They were deaf to all entreaty, and as a result he was forced to use an old well that had been on the farm since as far back as he could remember. But after a while the Israelis came again and blocked the well. This was a common practice, usually employed against Palestinian farmers in areas close to settlements with the aim of forcing them off their land. Starved of water, Abu Ibrahim's vines began to wither. "Come and see for yourselves," he exclaimed, and jumped up. We followed him out towards the vineyards. He pointed at them with a shaky hand and urged us to come closer, although the deplorable state they were in was obvious. "Look at this one," he cried, "or that one. Look how yellow and shriveled they are. See my grapes, so small, they never had a chance to ripen before they died." He strode agitatedly from vine to vine, holding up their desiccated branches for us to see. He was shaking with anger, and I wondered how many times a day he looked at them in just this way and felt the same rage each time. I thought he looked ill, his eyes hollow and unnaturally bright, and I doubted his body could withstand all that anger and shattering loss for much longer. And yet withal, he had a dignity that commanded respect. Chris, that's the journalist, told him how sorry he was and promised to publicize the story. And I murmured something too, but I felt ashamed of my impotence in the face of his tragedy. No matter what I said, it would only have been to try and comfort him, for what could I or any of us do that would make the slightest difference to the reality he was living through? Matters would take their course. The settlers and their army protectors would win, and Abu Ibrahim and his family would lose. We lost nothing. We said nothing about that and bade him goodbye, leaving him standing on the path, touching in his defiance and looking after us as we got back into the car and drove off. It was an image, one can never, never forget. Very, very sad. So one of the points of doing that, and you'll see I visit other places and they are described as vividly as I can, is the contrast between this bubble and all these people running around with rag and so on, and this terrible tragedy and reality. But I'll tell you the worst part about working for this pretend authority and a pretend government. Do you know, after a while, I started to believe in it, I mean, I could see they talked about a state and all the rest of it. I looked at them, I remember at the beginning, oh, poor people, what a fantasy, etc. After a bit, I was sucked into the fantasy. So I found myself worrying about a report for the minister and what would the minister say and had I got enough facts and, as if it were real. So, it's not that easy to shake off something which everybody else around you believes in, like the emperor's new clothes. You feel you're the odd person out. Parts of this book are in Jordan, in Amman, because what happened was that my father, who, with my mother, of course, we had all lived in London ever since 1949. We went in 1949. And my parents had their own home, they were established, and so after so many years, when they were really elderly, they decided they did not want to die in exile, as you might say. So they went to Jordan, which is, of course, very close to Palestine, and that was the closest they could get. And they spent their last days. Now, my mother died in 1991, but my father was still there when I went in 2005 to Ramallah. So I used to visit him. And so I got to know quite a lot of Amman. And so there are some chapters here about Amman. But as I was saying at the beginning, I all the time was obsessed with the idea of return, and that I had not returned. What did I return to? This sad situation of a people who are hemmed in by checkpoints and where their so-called government is pretending to be something which it was not, or pathetic really, and the situation of the Palestinians was worse and worse and worse with time. So what sort of return was this? And then I remembered, of course, that if there is one place where the idea of return and the hope of return and the reality of return is maintained, it is, of course, the refugee camps. Of course, it's the refugee camps. Now, there are very large refugee camps in Jordan, and I decided that I would visit. And I will never forget a visit I made to the largest of the camps, Bukka, some 12 miles north of Amman. It had a population of 100,000 and resembled a small town with its concrete houses, alleyways, and shops. But nothing could disguise the poverty and overcrowding of the typical refugee camp, the piles of uncollected refuse, the high unemployment rate, especially among the young men hanging around, and the general state of disrepair. But yet, there was in that camp an atmosphere I had not expected, a spirit of determination that transcended its shabby reality. To my surprise, people spoke not of their present hardship, but of the return to the homeland, their right to reclaim their lost homes and lives there, and hoped it would not take too long to happen. To them, it was no fantasy, but a solid belief in the inevitable recognition of the justice of their cause. And I remember realizing then what it was that distinguished this and all Palestinian refugee camps from their surroundings. On the outside, Bukka was a place in Jordan, but inside, it was a corner of Palestine that still lived on. No wonder the Israelis so hated the camps and attacked them at every opportunity. They too understood that despite their poverty and marginalization, the camps were islands of memory in an erased landscape, faithful repositories of a Palestinian history Israel had wanted obliterated. And for that, Israel wanted them dismantled and their refugees turned into immigrants scattered and dispersed in the various countries that would take them. And I tell you, it was such an uplifting experience. I remember feeling ashamed in a way that I had ever doubted the rightness of the right of return. I in fact had not, but you know, one tended to forget and so on. But there, these people, and I'd not known before. It was quite an extraordinary moment for me. And I realized they were different, these people. They were Palestine, you know. These people were all real Palestinians. Anyway, so this is how the book, in a sense, carries on. And then I went to Jerusalem, and there was another sort of reality in Jerusalem, which is also pretty shocking. And yet, you know, there was a kind of normality somehow about life on the West Bank, really, because one evening I know we went to a concert in Nablus, you know, and I thought, what, you know, a concert in Nablus, what's that? You know, anyway, no, it was fine. It was a recital, and two women. Older women, one played the piano beautifully, and she was the composer, and the other one sang. It's a lovely soprano voice. And the songs, that was what's so astonishing. Look, the audience were full of ladies in headscarves, so you understand, and a very high proportion of beards. And I thought, wait a minute, you know, what is this? And yet the music they were listening to and the singing was Western, you know, soprano, all this kind of thing. And they loved it. They were clapping and everything, you know. And I thought, well, who can blame them? Life has to go on, you know. You can't forever be wailing and weeping and so on. They have to get on. So there was also that, you know, in case you think it's just one long moan. Not at all. But nevertheless, what I wanted to do with the book was to convey to the reader a reality, the Palestinian reality today. Because you know, and I know, that the way it's presented, and particularly in this country, it's presented as somehow equivalent, you know. On the one hand, you've got Israel, which has got a government and an army, and on the other, you've got the Palestinian Authority, which has a militia, and, you know, has its own state, two states, and they can negotiate with each other, they can communicate with each other, and in that misrepresentation, the reality, of course, is completely disguised. And reality which nobody in the media or even people, by the way, who talk about this and who are supposedly sympathetic, what they won't do is represent the reality, what's really going on. And what's really going on isn't just Israeli brutality and how horrible, I don't mean that. The reality is this is a settler project. It's a settler colonial project. It was from the beginning. And the people it has colonized and whose lands it has stolen are living in a corner of their old homeland. That's the reality. Whether they've got something they call an authority, whether other people want to call it a government, is irrelevant. The reality is they are an occupied people. So why would you expect them to negotiate with their occupier or get any kind of deal out of the occupier, So I very much wanted to present the reader. I mean, this is a memoir, so it's not a political tract. It's a memoir seen through my eyes, how life really is, how people really fare. But of course, you realize that as I saw these things, I became more and more disheartened, really. I kept trying, apart from the refugee camps, which I've just told you about, but really, I saw people struggling from day to day. Who can blame them? They've got the army on their necks, they've got these checkpoints, they've got raids, which the army feels itself free to do whenever it feels like, which takes away young men, puts them in prison, It's as much as they can do to stand on their 2 feet and to survive. Now, when I went to Gaza, the impression was even more, even stronger. I don't honestly know, to tell you the truth, how. Let me see if I can find it. How they survived. I really don't know, because Gaza was so bad. It was so bad. I just can't tell you how bad it was. Whatever you read, however much you read, will never convey the reality. And I described it as well as I could. And I hope that when people read it, it's as if they were there. Now, in this extract, I walked out one morning. I was at the hotel in Gaza. And I woke early and decided to take a walk along the empty streets around the hotel, while it was still relatively cool. Since arriving in Gaza, I had seen little of the UN party I had come with. They were busy with their projects and had picked up 2 more workers who had been in Jerusalem and would return with us. Looking at the scenes around me, I might have been in a poor Indian city. Cracked pavements, mounds of rubble and sand, overflowing rubbish bins. A young boy passed by me, barefoot, sooty black with dirt, his blue eyes and fairish hair suggesting his normal complexion underneath was also fair. A grubby T-shirt and short trousers clothed his angular frame. The beaches were deserted, no throngs of skinny boys like him splashing and running in and out of the waves. The Israeli soldiers in their watchtower were awake like me, and I wondered how they felt as they watched the people below living in such dilapidation and poverty, just a few miles from their own modern, prosperous towns. Did they think those people wanted to live like that? For one mad moment, I wanted to shout up at them to come and talk to me, to drag them down from their watchtower by their bulletproof vests and their guns and their walkie-talkies. I wanted to push my face up against theirs and shout, "Look around you, properly. These are human beings here, not beasts, not vermin. They want to live decent lives like you. Understand?" The power of the image I had conjured up made me so shake with agitation, I had to walk on quickly to dissipate the feeling, and after a while, calm down. So, as you can see, these were the feelings it evoked in me. It was so wanton, so cruel in a way which is mindless. Why would you punish people who have done nothing to you? Why? Why would you besiege them? Why would you kill them? Why would you make their lives so intolerable? Why? What does it do for these Israelis? What do they get out of it? Really, I couldn't understand it. I felt incredibly angry. Anyway, so, things carried on. You know, there I was getting pretty disheartened, and so towards the end of my stay, um, I started to feel that perhaps, you know, the right of return would not happen, and as this thought struck me, I felt a shiver of alarm. Ever since we left Jerusalem and throughout my life, I had held on to our cause as that of a nation which was dispossessed and must one day return to its country. It was the underlying theme of all my writings, my lectures, and my political work for Palestine. I could not accept for that national cause to be whittled down to one of local occupation after 1967. Nor did I share the political fashion for what was called pragmatism in dealing with the right of return, shorthand for selling the refugees down the river. For me, return was at the heart of the issue. Without it, the injustice that had blighted our lives for generations would never cease. One day, when my sister and I had been discussing our fragmented family and how dispersed we were, how no one lived close to the other, each alone in the world, and how unnatural it all was, she said bitterly, "If we had never left our country, none of this would ever have happened. We would have been amongst our kin, growing up together, helping each other, none of us living or dying alone." And looking up to heaven, she raised her hands, palms upward in supplication, and exclaimed with quiet vehemence, "I pray to Almighty God that He may wreck their lives as they have wrecked ours." I knew there were formidable practical difficulties in the way of our return, an aim that seemed ever more unattainable with the passage of time, but I was determined that Israel should never be allowed to get away with what it had done, despite the resignation and defeatism of the Palestinian official stance and the indifference and cynicism I saw amongst many Palestinians around me. I never once doubted the rightness of my position, or that the crime committed against us in 1948 would somehow be redressed. I could not have lived with myself if I had thought differently. Such an injustice could not be allowed to stand for good, and the perpetrators would sooner or later have to give up their gains. The Palestinian refugee camps, which still stood after more than half a century, not one of them ever closed down, bore eloquent testimony to an unfinished business that would have to find its proper conclusion. But now, for the first time, my core belief in that certainty began to falter. I thought about the exiled Palestinian communities, long settled in Britain, Europe, America, and elsewhere. They were well established, and although they still remained devoted to what they called the cause of Palestine, and many of their children too, they went on entrenching themselves ever more deeply in their adopted countries. Many had found a workable accommodation for their commitment to the cause in the form of various activities and charitable works. These would not bring Palestine back, but it was a comfortable compromise that satisfied the demands of conscience and did not upset the tenor of everyday life. I could see this situation continuing for good. What cause did such exiles really adhere to? And how likely was it that any of them, so comfortably settled, would truly strive for the right of return? Could the refugees trapped in their camps, helpless and still dreaming of return, make anything happen? Would those whose primary concern was not the right of return, but the struggle against Israel's occupation, how to end it? Had Israel kept us out of our homeland for so long that we were forced to make alternative lives and thus suspend indefinitely our right of return? And in such circumstances, would any of us ever get back? The thought was unendurable. even to contemplate it sickened me. So that's how, but don't think that's how the book ends. So, you know, but you see how it made me feel, really. And I don't think this was fanciful. I think that what I said there is a representation of the true situation. I include myself, by the way. I am settled in Britain. I'm settled in London. My daughter was born in London. You know, I am settled, and so are you. Those of you who are Palestinians, you're settled. You have made lives here. You have homes. Will you return? Will you help us return? You know? So these truths were borne in on me. I just say to everybody that the adherence that we all feel to the Palestine cause, the fact that you all recognize the key, must always remain as the seed from which a plant will one day grow when circumstances allow.
Thank you very much, Ghada. I just want to remind you that Palestinians always refer to the Jews as our cousins.
Yeah.
Since we're both Semites. But my question to you, when you worked at that department shortly, for a short period, do they have a record of all the Palestinian property in Palestine?
Good question. First of all, the question of Jews being our cousins is a load of nonsense, because I know they say that, complete nonsense. They are about as Semitic as this Rome. They are not Semitic. They are mostly from Lithuania, Eastern Europe, and so on, have no connection with the Middle East or with Semitic races, so this is a big, big lie. Anyway, that aside, is there a record? Well, you know, there was a man called, oh dear, no. Oh God, he really very. His name has gone for. He really did a lot of work in the 1950s and 60s on the properties that were lost, but it was approximate because one of the tragedies is that the Palestinians themselves did not keep an inventory or a registry, and you can see why, because those poor, we all thought we'd go back. That was the tragedy. People thought, you know, why would you make an inventory of your home if you were only going to be away for a couple of weeks, you know, which is what people thought. My parents thought that. So in a sense, that's partly an explanation. However, it's a project that should be done, and it can be done, at least approximately, because UNRWA has records, you know, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The Jordanian government has other records because of the people who came across in 1948, and the Israelis have records, you see. So it needs somebody to make this a project, spend a bit of money, and put it all together. So it is theoretically possible. He did, but it was not Sami Hadawi. It's somebody else. And I know I remember him as soon as I've left. No, it wasn't him, but I know Sami Hadawi would be one person. No, this was somebody out of Kubursi. Is it? No, I can't remember. No, I can't remember. Anyway.
Well, you know, there was so much talk at one point in this country about separating Palestine or the Palestinian area really from the Israeli territory. My question to you, is there anybody in Palestine, either the Palestinian Authority or someone else, some other entity, that is really interested in doing that and wants to put that on the forefront, on the front burner all the time? Because if not, it's going to continue, as you say, continuously.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's a tragedy, really, of the Palestinians that not one state or authority or, you know, or an organization which was with real power has ever backed the Palestinians. The Arab states talked a lot about supporting the Palestine cause, but didn't adopt it in the sense of saying, we will liberate you, we will do this. Didn't happen. Iran is the nearest thing I can think of to a state which constantly affirms its support for the Palestinians. Sadly, that is the case, and that's one reason why, and that's another conclusion you'll find in the book, they'll have to fight. We, Palestinians, will have to fight with whoever we have as friends in civil society. We have to fight together, because forget about governments and the UN and so on.
Dr. Ghada, did your visit to Palestine include a visit to Palestinian villages and cities inside Israel and a meeting with the Palestinian community, what is so-called the 48 Arabs of Israel?
No, it didn't, and I didn't do that deliberately, because I had in an earlier book, In Search of Fatima, by the way, was a memoir. Let me just be quite clear, and that very much deals with going to pre-1948, or 1948 rather, 1948 Israel. This time I was determined to keep Israel out of it, because this was a Palestinian among Palestinians. So I wanted to leave it like that. There is a section in Jerusalem, you will find, in which I go to see our old house in Qatamon, and I find the bureau chief of the New York Times living above our house. They built an upper story which belongs to the New York Times. And I know. And he actually invited me, that's why I went, saying, I've read your book In Search of Fatima, and I think I'm living above your old house. And would you like to come and see it? So I went to see him, and it all described in the book, so I hope he reads it, and I hope he feels rotten when he reads it. Because I've not spared him, I tell you, he said, he claimed that he so admired the memoir, he thought it was terrific and how it evoked life. But then I said to him, okay, well, now you know what happened to us, and you're living above what used to be my home. I'm not here because you're here because I'm not here. See what I mean? How do you feel about Israel now? And he was evasive and said, oh, well, let's go and photograph your house, give you a memento, all this sort of thing. Could not get him to admit, not even for half a minute, that Israel had any part to play. So I didn't go in. That's the only bit of West Jerusalem that I went to.
I think you hit on something when you said you wanted to return and do something good there. With the attitude that you received when you went to the so-called ministry. Many of the Palestinians who live abroad want to do that. They want to go and spend some time and do something good. And I have met people there. I have one of them, I volunteered, but I was met with a lot of skepticism too. So I just wonder, there are doctors who go there, operate, and come back. And how much can Palestinians do when they're, like you said, they're comfortable and but there are pangs of consciousness on that we want to, conscience, we want to go and do something.
That's a very good question. I went under a very good United Nations program. That's how I went. It was run by UNDP, and it was precisely for people like the ones you're talking about and people like me. Palestinians who had an expertise in something. So it wasn't a tourist thing. And they were paid by the UN to come and be assigned. They offered the UN offered a range of experts to these ministries and said, we have an architect, or we have a senior physician, or would you like? And so the ministries took these experts, paid by the UN, of course, and it was good. That was a really good program, and it went on for quite a while. Unfortunately, it's closed down. So there was such a thing. Now, there's no reason, I suppose, why people might not, try to to reinvent that program, to make it happen again, partly. Now, you said about they're looked at in a particular way. You're quite right. I was looked at in a particular way, I can tell you, because, and I understand it, because they felt they're the ones suffering under, you know, the terrible situation, and there we were, you know, jetting about, having holidays and enjoying ourselves. So yes, there is a feeling, but of course, it made me unhappy, but I could understand what was behind it. You see, even Edward Said, if I just say, you know, he did so much for the cause of Palestine because of his writings, he was resented. And people did say, oh, what do you know, sitting in some cafe, you know, that sort of idea. No, perhaps somebody who hasn't asked a question before. Oh.
How do you explain the partiality of the media, the silence, the reluctance to represent an honest image or the reality of what's going on, distorting it, or just sometimes just ignoring it to it's. I feel sometimes it's sinful, you know, it's really evil what's being done to reverse the situations. And anything could be done about it?
Well, I mean, you're quite right to point to this media bias, because of course it shapes opinion, you know. You see, the problem is that, first of all, there's two problems. First, there is a reluctance, an ignorance actually, of what the conflict is about. What I started off by saying, this is a colonial, settler colonial project. There is an ignorance of the fact, there is real ignorance about the fact that is what the project is. And people have bought this Zionist story about a connection between the Jews and the Holy Land and so on and so forth. They bought it. But there is a second reason, which I think is really very sinister, which is the influence of the Zionists in all media, and they work at it night and day. You know, we often forget that to be able to turn the media around, to turn truth on its head, to make black white, you know, this kind of thing, requires tremendous hard work on the part of the lobbyists. They work at it day and night, day and night. So when you say, what could we do? I'm sorry to tell you, we don't have this readiness to do it. We have to work day. It can be done, but you have to work at it really hard. I'll give you one very good example. In England, where I know a number of people at the BBC, and friendly. And I, you know, at one point, I asked a very senior BBC person, and I said, look, the same thing that you said, because the BBC is biased. And we said, and he said, look, he said, you know what, he told me, he said, what the other side does, when there's a news story, they immediately, BBC editors receive a briefing from the Zionists, saying this is the story behind this. This, of course, all rubbish, you know. He said, I'd like to see your side do the same. Because he said every morning, which I didn't know, before they put out the news, they have an editorial meeting. And they look at the day's reports and the day's news, and they decide what is prominent, what is not, you know, what they should talk about. And he said, it's there. You've got to get these briefings to us fast. And then, you know, even when the Zionists do it, we've got two versions, you know. But, you know, I thought, who the hell's going to do that? Of our side, I mean. And you have to do that kind of thing. You can't expect that this media, which has been influenced, I would say, brainwashed by one side, to actually suddenly, of the goodness of their hearts, you know, to say, oh, no, this isn't fair. And by the way, as it might interest you to know, this is very, very old, this stuff with the Zionists being able to control everything. Do you know that in 1938, a very important book was published called Palestine, the Reality. And it was about a man, it was written by a man called J.M. Jeffries. And this man So anyway, this man was a correspondent in Palestine. He was a Daily Mail correspondent. And he was horrified. He went out there, he didn't know anything, and then he saw what he saw. And what he saw, he wrote in almost, you know, it's a fantastic record of what was happening, and it's horrible. It really tells you everything. And this was very big. But at that time, there was many attempts to suppress the book. Few copies of it survive. There were actually people who were writing reviews of it in a very unflattering way, implying that he didn't know what he was doing. As early as that, you see? So that's how far back their influence gets. The only reason I'm mentioning it is because I and a group of others are reissuing it. We worked on it, and it finally will be reissued and will be in the public domain. So I hope you'll all have a chance to acquire it, because it's a piece of history.
Where people talk about Israel when they're praying, and they're talking about the Israel of Jesus, when Jesus was born. And this is where it starts. We should tell them that this is not the real Israel we are fighting. The Israel of today is not the same Israel of the time in the Bible. This is where it should start.
Well, it is one of the places. And you're quite right. But I always say that if we on this side were to work properly, if each one asked him or herself, where can I be most effective? Look around me, where am I? Now, you say you might be a Christian who goes to your local church. You'll be more effective doing what, as is suggested here, through your local church and through other churches and through the whole network, Christian network, than you would be running around doing a TV documentary, for example. But our problem is that if everybody did the same, for example, ask themselves, now what can I do in my locality with my expertise, you will find that between us, we have all kinds of areas of expertise which we could exploit. So if all of these people were working together, you'd get a result. What we have, sadly, is everybody trying to do somebody else's job, you know, and it's the same people. There's a whole group of people trying to do, emulate somebody who's doing whatever. So that it's doomed to failure.
This has been a very moving and inspiring talk. I think everyone feels that. And I'm very glad to hear you speak of Israel as a colonial settler state, because I think this has been a huge problem in this country in terms of doing solidarity, that is not drawn out. I feel that it's really important to be as accurate as possible, and I don't think it's accurate to say that the Jewish population is not, at least in part, Semitic. I think that the Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, apparently there was an indigenous population there that converted to Judaism. However, after during the Inquisition, when people were dispersed, the Sephardic Jews, they went not only to Northern Africa and back into the Middle East or Southwest Asia, but they also dispersed to Eastern Europe, where they would have, or Central Europe, where they would have intermarried. But that still does not justify coming into Palestine and taking over people's homes. I mean, I wouldn't be welcome back in Scotland, I'm sure, you know, taking over people's homes, even though there's complete ethnic identification. But I did also want to say that we have to be really careful, and I'm very outspoken against Zionism, but it's a political ideology, and Jewish people are a minority, a severe minority. The reason that there has not been more opposition has to do with the fact that Israel was originally conceived by Herzl as being he appealed to the European powers and to the Russian Tsar for support on the basis of the fact that Israel, the Jews that settled in Palestine would be, quote unquote, an outpost of civilization among the barbarians. In other words, Israel was always designed to perform a certain role for the imperialist powers. And the corporate media, if the powers that be, the corporations, really wanted to stop this, they'd turn on a dime. And yeah, I'm sorry, but the whole thing is very dangerous for Jewish people as well as Palestinians in the long run if you don't recognize what the real power sources are and what role Israel plays in the imperialist project in the Middle East. And we can't ever forget that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very well put.
Yes, thank you. Actually, the most recent and most comprehensive DNA studies of Ashkenazi Jews, mitochondrial DNA, published in a very reputable scientific journal about 2 years ago, indicate that among European or Ashkenazi Jews, following the mother's lines of ancestry, only 8% of their DNA comes from, quote, the Near East, unquote. So this doesn't even narrow it down to ancient Jews. So I think you're both right. Essentially, Dr. Karmi is correct. At only 8% of the DNA comes from the Near East or possibly from the ancient Jews. There was a great deal of proselytizing and conversion to Judaism, especially in the ancient Roman period. And many non-Jews converted to Judaism and intermarried with the Jewish population at that time. So actually the study concluded, I'm almost finished, that the population today that modern European Jews are most closely related to are not anybody in the Near East, but rather the Italians. Ashkenazi Jews are essentially a European people.
Thank you.
I'll just take it over. Have somebody who hasn't asked a question yet.
Thank you for the presentation. It's actually great that we're talking about empowering Palestine and the Palestinians. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize the imbalance of power and so on and so forth. One example would be, like, really quick, the AIPAC in the US. So considering that it's impossible to actually completely turn the truth on its head, what is it that is practical that you would say the coming Palestinian generation should do to empower themselves in their country?
Good question. Well, first of all, the fact that something might not be as successful as you would like it to be doesn't stop you from doing it. So we need to do anything and everything, because this is a very, very big enemy. You're quite right. Very powerful, very well supported. But if I were to be specific, I would recommend the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I really think this is one of the most exciting developments I've seen in a lifetime of activism. It's wonderful, and it's spreading like wildfire. So, you know, that is something for the young people to get their teeth into. There's a lot to be done. For example, those of you who are students, let's say, you need to find out what your university is investing in. And if it's investing pension funds in Israeli companies, you publicize that, name and shame, have a big campaign against them, and a lot of them have divested once they've been, you know. So there's a lot of that kind of work to be done. By the way, apropos of BDS, I just want to tell you something which is, I think, should excite you quite a lot. In England, on Wednesday, the Guardian newspaper published a big advert. A whole page was taken over by an advert placed there by an academic boycott group, an academic boycott against Israel group. And they had got the signatures of over 300 university academics, many of them professors, to sign up to a statement which they called the commitment, and which is in the middle of the page. It's so striking, it's in your face, it's like that, and it says, we support the cause of Palestinian justice. And then it goes on, we commit not to work with Israeli academic institutions, not to accept their invitations, not to invite representatives of theirs, not to deal with them in any way until they respect international law and human rights. And it's terrific. You can imagine over 300 since the time, because I'm one of them, I mean, I'm one of the people who worked on it. Since the time it was published, Wednesday, 150 further signatories joined. So immediately from all over the world, and I don't know how many more because I then traveled. So that's the kind of thing. Now, I needn't tell you that the Zionist lobby has gone absolutely mad, absolutely mad. This is the sort of thing they really hate, you know. So anyway, plenty more where that came from.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our talk today, but Dr. Karmi will be here to sign books, and maybe you can talk to her individually, those of you who still had questions. I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Karmi, for being with us, for your enlightening talk, your passionate talk, and for these wonderful vignettes that you read to us, which are poignant and meaningful. You made us, you pulled at our heartstrings, you also made us uncomfortable, and you made us think some more. So thank you so much.
Thank you.